that's the $10,000 question, isn't it? Maybe it's the $10 billion question.
America and most countries of the world really are run by a very small percentage of the population.
Not even the President of the United States. It's the money men.
Obviously, the people in government aren't always the ones getting rich, so then you have to ask who are the ones behind it that are really getting rich, that are enjoying the benefits of this ripoff.
What happens if we slice through the back of that system? Set aside the system, you know, how you approach the power of the United States of America, how you lobby for a bill, how anyone can become president, how anyone can appeal to the people and ask for them to be voted into office. What happens if you go behind the scenes and just open the panel door and see how the system of power is really wired?
The interests of the American public have no bearing in the direction of the country, in the policy decisions. It doesn't matter which party we're talking about either. Republicans, Democrats, it's all the same thing. There's no voice for the people.
I think we're being controlled by a relatively small group of extremely powerful individuals that are pretty much pulling the strings behind both major parties, as well as the economic and financial institutions.
We're supposed to have the people being represented by the Congress, and this is a check and balance system. But instead, you have all branches of government owned by major corporations.
The folks who run America are the people who operate behind the scenes to make sure that the person who is in the seat of president and Congress and the people who we elect are the people that will do their bidding.
I think what you see is what it is. And who runs America are the banks and the multinationals. It's as simple as that as I see it. And they're the ones that have made all the decisions that have put us in the place that we're in now.
In 1937, Ferdinand Lundberg, who'd been a writer with the Wall Street Journal and other financial publications, wrote a book called America 60 Families. And in that book, he documented that the country was being run by an oligarchy of the wealthiest families, including the Mellons and the DuPonts and the Morgans and the Rockefellers and the Warburgs. And he showed that they were running the country as an invisible government behind the democracy that we see upon the surface.
In fact, a study by Princeton University has come out saying that the United States is more of an oligarchy than it is a republic or democracy. Why? Because the public has no say in the policies and in the system that's been set up by politicians.
Go back to 2008. The financial crisis is going on. Henry Paulson, U.S. Treasury Secretary. Where did he come from? Goldman Sachs, right, CEO. Gets in front of the American people and tells us that he's going to save us little people from the problems we have in the real estate market. But in order to do that, we have to bail out the too big to fails. Too big to fail. 4 words. Shows you who's running the country. Capitalism, there's no such thing as too big to fail. It's fascism. It's a multinational takeover. We bailed out the banks.
It's the unseen people that I'm more concerned about, really, because there's got to be someone, somewhere, that creates the agenda that all these people must follow.
In the late 19th century, wealthy monopolists, most prominently John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, were growing in economic and political power. Americans were increasingly alarmed at Wall Street's domination of both the Democrat and Republican parties. This led, in the 1890s, to the formation of the grassroots Populist Party. The Rockefeller-Morgan Axis decided to distract Americans with a new enemy: Spain. The choice was not coincidental. Spain ruled Cuba, which by the 19th century had become the world's richest colony and largest sugar producer. National City Bank coveted Cuba's white gold as a complement to Standard Oil's black gold. The Yellow Press, led by William Randolph Hearst, New York Journal, began inundating Americans with fabricated tales of Spanish oppression. Spaniards feeding Cubans to sharks, roasting Cuban priests, slaughtering hospital patients where no hospital even existed. The decision to send the Maine to Havana was made at a secret White House meeting of which no minutes were kept. The Spanish government was not expecting the Maine when it sailed into Havana Harbor. Captain Charles Sigsbee, captain of the Maine, said,
"It became known to me afterward that the Maine had not been expected, even by the United States Consul General."
By what oversight was no one in Havana notified of the battleship's arrival? However, no shooting erupted. The Spanish permitted the Maine to dock. For 3 weeks, the Maine sat in Havana Harbor. In the meantime, the Yellow Press drove anti-Spanish feelings to fever pitch. William Randolph Hearst paid bribes to have the correspondence of the Spanish ambassador spied upon. One letter, critical of McKinley, was stolen and reprinted in Hearst's journal under the headline, "The Worst Insult to the United States in Its History." 2 days later, a horrific explosion tore apart the Maine. 266 men were killed. A U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry attributed the explosion to an external device, but was unable to assign any blame. The Yellow Press had no reservations. The bombing, they claimed, was the work of the Spanish government. Americans were goaded into war with the battle cry, "Remember the Maine." Here, Spain is depicted as a semi-human brute, its bloodied hand on the grave of the Maine and its foot trampling an American flag. The war was immortalized in American public memory by one-sided naval victories. Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. And the charge up San Juan Hill. But did Spain really sink the Maine? All Spanish documents reveal that Spain wished to avoid war with America at all costs. Her mostly wooden navy could not hope to compete with the modern U.S. Navy, which consisted increasingly of steel ships. Admiral Cervera, who commanded Spain's Atlantic Squadron, warned his government of
our lack of everything that is necessary for a naval war, such as supplies, ammunition, coal, provisions, etc. We have nothing at all.
A provocative act against America, such as sinking the Maine, was clearly the last thing desired by the Spanish. But who did want to sink the Maine? Detectives often solve crimes by examining who profited from them. To help finance the war, the Rockefellers' National City Bank loaned the U.S. government $200 million. No income tax then existed. To help repay the loan, a telephone use tax was levied on the American people. It remained in effect for over a century. The loan was negotiated by Assistant Treasury Secretary Frank Vanderlip. After the war, National City Bank made Vanderlip its president. In that capacity, as we will see, he participated in the infamous Jekyll Island meeting, where the Federal Reserve Bank was secretly created. Mark Twain wrote,
"When the smoke was over, the dead buried, and the cost of the war came back to the people, it suddenly dawned on us that the cause of the Spanish-American War was the price of sugar."
The Rockefeller-Stillman National City Bank benefited most directly from it, for Cuba, soon afterward, became dotted with National City branches, and the Cuban sugar industry gravitated into national cities' hands.
The Spanish-American War was the first war that persuaded Americans that the purpose of our military was not just self-defense, that we had to go overseas and fight wars on other people's behalf, and that became a pattern that continued ever since.
So without William Randolph Hearst, who championed this and who maybe was one of the people that stood to gain from the new possession, gain from the Spanish-American War, without him and without Hearst newspapers, there would have been no problem with the Maine.
The phrase false flag, I think, is becoming more and more familiar to more Americans than it used to be. First time I ever heard that phrase was probably about 20 years ago, and I thought, what does this mean? I think many Americans are still in that category. What does that mean?
Well, first off, so people understand what we're talking about with false flags, that goes back to the days of the old sailing ships, and everybody had their country's flag. And the idea was, it took a long time for two sailing ships to approach each other, and so they wanted to get up close so they could attack, and so they would put another country's flag up. Say they were pirates, they'd put a British flag up and then get right next to you. Then they'd run up the pirate flag and board your ship. So that's where it became known as a false flag. The event seems to be something other than what it truly is.
False flags, when you cover them, first of all, it's a tough term to even use, right? Because as soon as you say false flag, we've started conditioning people to see that as conspiratorial. And when anything's conspiratorial, that means it's not true, right? Because if you listen to most media, a conspiracy theorist or conspiracies are all urban legends, right? They're all myths. When in fact, there are many, many conspiracies all throughout American history and world history.
It's not even controversial to say that the United States has used false flag because it's now documented. It's a part of history.
General Smedley Butler wrote a book after World War I that I've read, and I know many of your viewers have as well. War is a racket. And indeed, in many ways it is. And I think that we have noticed over the years that some of the events that led up to war were not accidental.
I found myself going back and looking at World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, everything. Could we have been lied to about everything? And that was my fearful kind of approach to this is that even possible?
I would say they always follow a specific formula of create as much fear and trauma as possible. And then in that traumatization of the public, they're eliciting a specific psychological response. And that response is a cry for protection.
False flags have always been necessary to generate the kind of fear of outsiders or the imagined enemy that governments need in order to support the ridiculous policy of war in the first place.
Stage one is brute force. Stage two is staging something or creating an external enemy so that you then become the rescuer and people do what you say out of sheer fear. And then stage three is really getting to the point where you don't even require enemies any longer, where you can simply convince people through psychological manipulation to do the thing that you want them to do.
(1915). World War I is underway. Britain is at war with Germany. America has not yet joined the conflict. May 7th. A British ocean liner, RMS Lusitania, is on her way from New York to England. Nearly 200 Americans are among the passengers. 2:10 p.m., off Ireland's southern coast, a torpedo from a German U-boat strikes the Lusitania. More than 1,000 on board lose their lives. On both sides of the Atlantic, the public is told the Germans sank the Lusitania simply to kill women and children. The tragedy fans outrage